Hello everyone. For my next few videos, I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about Victorian England. Much of my interest in Victorian England comes as an extension of my interest in Romantic poetry, the Romantic period, and the various movements that fed into and inspired the Romantic period. One of the interesting things about the Victorian period for me comes from something that I remember one of my teachers said one time when I was maybe 18, 19 years old in describing the Victorian period. He essentially said that the Victorians were romantics with reservations. And it's important to understand the attempted synthesis that the Victorians attempted to make out of romantic enthusiasm and romantic rebellion in Victorian times. So in order to talk about this, I would like to read some excerpts from an article that I found on the internet. Probably the most important American scholar to understand when studying the Romantics is M.H. Abrams. Whenever I was writing about the Romantics when I was at university in America, I would frequently refer to M.H. Abrams and his ideas. And I think understanding these will help us understand the general thought patterns and cultural milieu of the Victorians. So I would like to take some time to read from this short essay at length and discuss some of this a little later. So M.H. Abrams' enormously influential The Mirror and the Lamp, Romantic Theory and the Critical Tradition, first published in 1953, provides a valuable way into the problem of defining Victorianism in art and literature. Abrams begins his argument by pointing out that the once near universal tendency to discuss art in terms of author and artist arrived on the scene quite late in the 2,500-year-old history of aesthetics and critical theory. Abrams writes, "To pose and answer aesthetic questions in terms of the relation of art to the artist, rather than to external nature, or to the audience, or to the internal requirements of the work itself, was the characteristic tendency of modern criticism up to a few decades ago, and it continued to be the propensity of a great many, perhaps the majority of critics today. This point of view is very young when measured against the 2,500-year history of Western theory of art. For its emergence as a comprehensive approach to art shared by a large number of critics, dates not much more than a century and a half." So before he can demonstrate the momentous consequences for the identification, the analysis, the evaluation, and the writing of poetry of these comparatively recent ways of looking at literature and art, Abrams explains that all the discussions of them discuss four elements: text or work, author, reality or nature, and audience, but define themselves by which one of the four that they emphasize. So here, Abrams is discussing the amount of importance critics place on understanding a work. Do they emphasize the text itself, the author, its relationship with reality or nature, you can think kind of historical, contextual, or its relationship with the audience? One of the changes that came about in the Romantic period was the centralization and the importance of the author's role in creating a text. Authors and poets and writers are often seen in the Romantic context as kind of being inspired figures, harking back to a bardic tradition in which the poet or writer or author is an inspired individual communicating truths that are deeply personal. So whereas with the neoclassical period, there was an emphasis on rationality, on reason, and on the universality of poetry and the claims and arguments made by different poets and different writers, with the Romantic period, we see a stress on the individuality and the uniqueness of people as a whole, but also on the various poets and writers from this period. This is why there's an abundance of biographical information and an almost cult obsession with many of these Romantic writers, like Lord Byron or John Keats or Shelley. The author takes a more central purpose in his or her work than ever before. And to continue the quote, sorry. So these four elements: text or work, author, reality or nature, and audience. These four elements in the total situation of a work of art are discriminated and made salient by one or another synonym in almost all theories which aim to be comprehensive. First, there is the work, the artistic product itself. And since this is a human product, an artifact, the second common element is an artificer or artist. Third, the work is taken to have a subject, which directly or indirectly is derived from existing things, to be about or signify or reflect something which either is or bears some relation to an objective state of affairs. On this third element, whether held to consist of people and actions, ideas and feelings, material things and events, or supersensible essences, has frequently been denoted by that word of all work, nature. But let us use the more neutral and comprehensive term universe instead. For the final element, we have the audience, the listeners, spectators, or readers to whom the work is addressed, or to whom at any rate it becomes available. So at this point, Abrams, having set forth the framework, the argument to follow, says, beginning with the relation of the work or text to nature or universe, to explain the implications of each approach. Abrams labels mimetic those explanations of the work of art as essentially an imitation or aspect of the universe, and he discusses the quite different forms it takes in the writings of Plato and Aristotle. A central part of all such mimetic theories, and one which probably surprises the most modern readers, lies in their conception of the roles of artist and poet, who do not have what Abrams terms a determinative function. That is, although poets are indispensable, their personal faculties, feelings, or desires are not called upon to explain the subject matter or form of a poem. No one cares, in other words, if the poet is sincere or original, only accuracy and truthfulness count. So from this first understanding of literature and art and the role of the artist, a mimetic critic emphasizes the nature in which the work of art mirrors the natural world, mirrors nature. The feelings of the poet, the feeling of the artists, not important. The feelings of the audience are not important. Art is seen as primarily a representation of nature, and the degree to which it reflects nature accurately is the standard criticism of art from this approach. Here, Abrams is principally talking about Aristotle, and Aristotle's approach towards literary criticism is often described as mimetic. The next category, the approach to art that emphasizes its relationship to audience, Abrams labels as pragmatic, since it looks at the work of art chiefly as a means to an end, an instrument for getting something done, and tends to judge its value according to its success in achieving that aim. The central tendency of the pragmatic critic is to conceive a poem as something made in order to effect certain responses in its readers. This essentially is a rhetorical approach, which characterizes critical theory from the Renaissance through much of the 18th century, and leads in turn to an emphasis upon distinct genres or artistic and literary kinds, each with its own specific techniques or ends. Tragedy, for example, must have a noble characters, elevated diction, and employ certain poetic devices, such as elaborate metaphor to produce pity and fear. Pastoral, lyric, satire, burlesque all have their own rules. For this critical position, sees literary genres or kinds as forms of technology that can or should produce specific definable effects in the reader. Once again, no one cares if the poet is sincere or original, only effect and effectiveness and skill in the following the rules counts. So this is the idea of this pragmatic approach, ties in with this idea of rhetoric and rhetorical approach. So how effective is the author at conveying his message through using different rhetorical devices, manners of speech, types of argument, etc. With the Romantic period, there's a shift which Abrams identifies, and he calls this expressive theories of art. With expressive or romantic theories come all the criteria with which we are familiar at last. Spontaneity, sincerity, originality, intensity, alienation. Poetry is the overflow, utterance, or projection of the thought and feelings of the poet. Or else, in the chief variant formulation, poetry is defined in terms of the imaginative process which modified and synthesizes the images, thought, and feelings of the poet. A work of art is essentially the internal made external, or expressed. I always think of this approach as reactive. The artist-poet confronts nature or society, has a reaction that takes the form of a powerful emotional and imaginative experience that he or she later expresses. As you can see, this reflects Wordsworth's idea of the powerful overflow of emotions recollected in tranquility. The writer here essentially makes the same argument about the expressive or romantic theory of art and poetry. Kinds, literary or painterly genres, even the audience no longer appear central. And in fact, the subjective nature of the artist-poet's experience almost guarantees several things. First, the resulting text or picture will appear to the audience as new, novel, and possibly strange or even weird. Second, the creator will always be ahead of the audience. Third, as Wordsworth put it, truly great art and literature advance so beyond the audience's expectations that it must create the taste by which it is to be enjoyed. And fourth, manifestos, prefaces, critics, and interpretive criticism become centrally important, as does the notion of avant-garde, since someone has to explain and defend art and artists to audience. Abrams' work as a whole, the mirror and the lamp, goes at great lengths. That's where I got confused. To explore this expressive theory of art, which the Romantic movement ushered in, and how you can see it in their various works and the effects that it would have on later ages. Abrams will also comment on this Victorian synthesis, as it is called in this article. So the writer says, leaving aside the fourth category, objective theories ranging from arts for art's sake to new criticism that concentrate upon the work itself, we can turn to the question of Victorianism in literature and the arts. For all the great poetry and art produced by the Romantic generations, many 19th century readers and writers believe their approach tended towards egotism and excessive subjectivity. Nonetheless, at the same time that Thomas Carlyle proclaimed that his contemporaries should close their Byron and open their Goethe, which many readers reconfigured as close Byron and read Carlyle. That's a joke there. They had passed the Great Divide, one of the central ones in Western and intellectual and social history, and could not return to the elegant and scathing satire of the Augustans. As E.D.H. Johnson points out more than a half century ago in The Alien Vision of Victorian Poetry, the Victorian project involved finding literary and artistic means of bridging a series of what they understood to be binary oppositions: self and society, personal and political, subjective and objective. Above all, as Carlyle managed to do in Sartor Resartus, Tennyson in In Memoriam, and Dickens in Great Expectations, they had to find public uses for very private experiences, without either becoming egotistical or making themselves vulnerable. Thus, the necessity of developing the dramatic monologue, a form I'll discuss, and new forms of autobiography and autobiographical fictions. Carlyle's Sartor Resartus certainly falls into this, as well as In Memoriam by Tennyson. In other words, the Victorians had to find a way to create a synthesis of what Abrams calls pragmatic and expressive forms of art. And I think that's probably the central thesis in my understanding of the Victorian epoch and the art that comes from it, is the authors, the poets, the writers, many times the critics. They're trying to arrive at this compromise between the expressive forms of art which characterized the Romantics, but in many ways led to an excess of subjectivity and even egotism in people who followed Romantic theories and wrote Romantic poetry, made Romantic art, and pragmatic theories of art. And again, pragmatic, we want to think rhetorical. The ways in which the artist works as a craftsman to create a beautiful work of art following certain laws, examples from the past, etc. to affect his or her purpose, whether it is to create change in society, to create emotion in the reader, etc. So the Victorian period is, in my estimation, very much an attempt to wed these two aspects of critical theory towards the creation of art, the pragmatic and expressive ideals. Characteristically, Victorian literature, therefore, attempts bravely and often successfully to combine the individuality, originality, intensity, and above all, sincerity of Wordsworth and Keats with public accessibility and the social relevance of Pope and Johnson. Alexander Pope and Johnson are, of course, two of the greatest writers of the neoclassical age in Britain. So this is what I meant at the beginning of the video, where I mentioned I see the Victorians as romantics and reservations, and this article ends by mentioning their attempted synthesis of neoclassical and romantic ideals. And this is something that I'm going to explore in greater context when I talk about some individual poets, writers, and movements in the next few videos.